What if a single card could show you the truth about the people closest to you, not through their words, not through their promises, but through what they chose to do when no one was watching? Ethan Whitaker, a man who built an empire from a Rust Belt garage, had all the money anyone could dream of. Yet, in his glass and timber house high in the Rockies, he drank cold coffee alone. Wealth gave him headlines, but not trust. Applause filled his life, but not the quiet safety of a hand he could rely on. So, one winter, he did something unthinkable. He placed 3 black envelopes on his desk. Inside each was a limitless credit card, one for Madison, the woman who mirrored his status, one for Victoria, the strategist who managed his storms, and one for Claire, the quiet secretary who kept his ordinary world together. 72 hours, no rules, no explanations, only choices. Would they spend on themselves? Would they build ladders to climb away from him? Or would one of them remember what he had forgotten, that dignity and mercy are worth more than diamonds? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that could change the way you see your own. The house stood in silence, a glass and timber frame holding its breath against the cold, the kind of home that made magazines call it stunning, though Ethan Whitaker had long since stopped noticing the way light struck the beams. Morning crept in without ceremony. A rim of frost had crept up the porch steps overnight, and the wind from the ridge combed the tall pines until they bent with a sound like sighing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of roasted beans. His coffee sat on the counter, poured 20 minutes ago, steam already gone. He touched the cup, lifted it halfway, and set it down again. Cold. Like so much in his life, it had cooled before he even reached for it. He walked across the wide planked floor, the scrape of ceramic against wood following him like a reminder. He should have been on a call with his board, smoothing over questions about the warehouse accident that made headlines last month. A forklift had failed, a worker injured. The official statements were polished until they shone. But behind the polish, Ethan felt the bruise of truth. His empire had grown too fast, stretched too thin, and now men and women carried the weight of his ambition in their bodies. The board wanted him to smile through it, to say all the right phrases about safety reviews and commitment to excellence. He was tired of being managed, tired of turning grief into copy. He moved toward the window. Below, the valley spread wide and white, a quilt of snow stitched with dark seams of road. Somewhere out there, trucks carried his name on their sides, promises of efficiency and speed. But in this house, everything was still. His reflection in the glass wore fatigue like an unshaven shadow. At 45, he had more than he had ever dreamed, and less than he had truly needed. His hand found the small wooden box on the shelf near the fireplace. He did not open it. He never opened it, but he rested his fingers on the lid as though it still carried warmth. Inside were fragments of another life, his mother's handwriting, an old photo corner, maybe even the scent of Ohio earth, if memory could be bottled. Ruth Whitaker had been a woman of little means but endless wisdom. She used to sit with him on the porch swing, the slats cold even through his jeans, winter biting at their ears. Her voice always softer than the wind. "Build more than walls," she would say, rocking gently. "Walls keep people out. Build something that keeps them in." That sentence followed him into adulthood like a North Star. Yet somewhere between contracts, mergers, and 100 headlines calling him visionary, he had lost the map. He had built walls beautiful, high, expensive walls, but he had not built a place where he felt at home. He looked toward the kitchen counter where 3 envelopes waited, stark against the marble, black, unmarked, except for silver ink spelling out 3 names: Madison, Victoria, Claire. His chest tightened. Each woman stood in his life for a different reason, each one close enough to shape his days. Madison, the girlfriend who filled rooms with laughter and cameras. Victoria, the strategist who handled storms with flawless precision. And Claire, the quiet secretary who made sure flights, files, and forgotten birthdays were remembered. yet asked for nothing in return. He had thought about this decision for weeks. Not a stunt, not a trick, a test, but not the kind with traps, a plea. He needed to know if trust still existed in the world he had built. Money had a way of stripping people bare, showing what mattered most to them. If he gave them freedom, if he handed over a card without rules, would he finally see truth instead of polish? His throat felt dry. He poured another coffee, though he doubted he would drink it. The act was a habit, a rhythm that filled the silence. He pictured his mother's hands wrapping his when he was a boy, warming them with breath. That memory, more than board meetings or profit charts, was what carried him now. 3 women, 72 hours, no limits. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for kindness, for proof that the world still held people who built, not just shined. The snow outside thickened, flakes tumbling like ash in the wind. He pressed his palm flat against the counter, beside the envelopes. They looked harmless, but they felt like thunderheads, waiting to break. Somewhere in those folds lay his answer, whether he was surrounded by mirrors or by someone who could see past the glass. The house creaked as if shifting its weight, old timber remembering storms. Ethan turned from the window, and the frost on the glass blurred the world beyond. Tomorrow, everything would change. He earned everything and misplaced the one thing he needed: safety in another person's hands. That truth followed Ethan like a shadow, stretching across decades of ambition and loss. When he closed his eyes, Ohio came back. The Rust Belt town of his boyhood still hummed with the sound of shift whistles, factory gates clanging shut at dusk. Winters were long, gray, and hungry. He wore second-hand coats that smelled faintly of other children's soap, boots lined with cardboard when the soles split open. Yet there was comfort, too, his mother's hands warming his ears after he trudged home from school through biting wind. Ruth never had much, but she had enough love to keep him from breaking. On nights when the pipes rattled and the furnace coughed, she would wrap him in a blanket and sway on the porch swing, her voice steady. "Build more than walls," she whispered into the dark. "Build something that keeps people in." That memory had built him as surely as any education. Years later, when the factories dimmed and the jobs left town, Ethan refused to let the same thing happen to him. He threw himself into the only thing he trusted: work. In a rented garage that smelled of oil and damp concrete, he started the company that would later stretch across continents. The early years were lean. He lived on canned soup, invoices taped to the fridge as if the paper could feed him. His pickup truck coughed awake only after a prayer and a hard turn of the key. He wore the same jacket every day, the fabric growing thin at the elbows. There were victories, too. His first shipment arrived on time. His first hire shook his hand with gratitude that burned in Ethan's chest like fuel. He had tasted what it meant to build, and he was determined never to lose that flavor. But life, as he learned, doesn't pause for the builder. Somewhere in those years, he had married a woman who once believed in his drive, who held his hand in that drafty garage and said she trusted him. Yet speed is a merciless companion. As his business took flight, their love thinned, stretched beyond recognition. She wanted dinners and presents. He gave her red-eye flights and constant meetings. The applause of investors drowned out the quiet requests of his own home. Eventually, papers were signed, boxes packed, silence delivered. He had won his empire, but lost the one person who should have felt safe beside him. Applause could not tuck him in at night. Headlines did not hold him when sleep refused to come. He carried the lesson like a scar: success could build walls higher than any failure. Now, at 45, he lived in a house praised in magazines and eyed by strangers. Yet he slept in sheets that felt cold no matter the season. His mind would not rest. The congressional hearing loomed questions about worker safety, about his company's culture. Shareholders pressed him with polite panic, their voices sugar-coated but sharp underneath. And always, insomnia. Nights when he paced the house, footsteps echoing too loudly, the stars over Colorado blurring into a smear. What he wanted was not more. It was less performance, less polish, less pretending. He wanted someone to see him apart from the glow of money. Someone who could look through the walls he had built and remind him of that porch swing, piece the steady sway of belonging. The envelopes on his counter represented that desperate search, a dangerous kind of hope, if he handed them out. If he let money peel back the layers of polish, maybe he would finally know who around him was real. He had wrestled with the idea for weeks, even written and torn up drafts of rules. But rules would ruin it. It had to be clean. 72 hours. Anything legal, no questions asked. He would observe, but never intrude. He would not spy, only witness. Tonight, he almost canceled. His hand hovered over the envelopes as doubt pressed against his chest. Was this fair? Was it human? Or was it just another wall, disguised as a window? The temptation to put them back in the drawer, to pour another drink and let the world remain half-seen, gnawed at him. Then the memory returned, Ruth's voice, softer than the wind. Build more than walls. He steadied himself, shoulders loosening. He was not trying to trap anyone. He was trying to open a door. The snow had thickened outside. He stepped to the window, where the ridge blurred under heavy white, and then, across the long driveway. Headlights broke the dusk. One car climbing the mountain road, wheels crunching against ice. The first envelope would change hands tonight. 3 envelopes, no rules. A clock that would draw a clean line between shine and soul. Ethan stood with them on the counter, the silver ink catching the light, and felt the quiet weight of his own decision. The terms were simple. 72 hours. Anything legal? No approvals required, no check-ins. A limitless card, sliding doors wide open to whatever desire or duty pulled hardest. He had written the rules down once, then burned the paper in the fireplace. He didn't want a contract. He wanted freedom to speak louder than words. But he was not reckless. Transactions and locations would be logged, pings of digital footprints marking the path of each card. There would be no surveillance of private spaces, no eavesdropping, no hidden microphones. He would not strip them of dignity. He would only observe how choice unfurled when no eyes were watching. Why these 3 Madison, Victoria, Claire? They were not random names. Each one carried a different mirror of his life. Madison, the girlfriend who sparkled beside him at galas and whispered content into every moment. She mirrored status. When people looked at her, they saw proof that Ethan Whitaker could buy youth, beauty, and lifestyle on demand. Victoria, the communications chief who spun storms into headlines that made him look untouchable. She was the strategist, the shield, the one who could turn a mistake into a narrative of resilience. With her, image was safe even if the truth beneath it stayed fragile. And Claire, his secretary of nearly a decade. She booked his flights, remembered his appointments, made sure birthday cards reached nieces he barely called. She held together the ordinary world he often ignored. She lived without noise, without performance, her presence quiet as a breath. He had told himself this was an experiment, but underneath, he nursed a hope he was embarrassed to admit, even to himself, that one of them would choose mercy over display. That one would remind him not everything had a price tag. The deliveries unfolded like a sequence of theater. First, Madison at the mountain ranch. She arrived with boots still dusted from aspen shops, her laughter bright against the wooden beams. He placed the envelope in her hand, and her eyes lit up before she even asked what it was. She kissed his cheek and hurried back to her car, already calling a friend. The card looked small against her manicured fingers, but the energy in her voice was big, rising like champagne fizz. Second, Victoria in the Denver headquarters. The building gleamed with glass and steel, every floor humming with curated efficiency. He met her in the corner office she often borrowed for meetings. He slid the envelope across the desk, and she raised an eyebrow, controlled as always. She didn't squeal or smile too wide. She simply nodded, the corner of her mouth curling with calculation. She thanked him with a tone measured like currency. He knew by nightfall she would have already mapped how to turn it into power. Finally, Claire. He didn't stage the moment. He left the envelope on her desk, tucked beside a stack of files and her favorite blue pen. When she returned from the copy room, she found it waiting. She picked it up slowly, as if it might not belong to her. He watched from his doorway, silent. She turned the envelope in her hands, tracing the letters of her name, then looked toward him with hesitation. Her eyes asked what her mouth didn't dare. He only nodded, a small tilt of his head. She opened it carefully, sliding the card out with the same care she gave to handling fragile documents. Her fingers lingered, and in that pause, Ethan felt something strike deep. The hesitation landed like a bell in an empty chapel. She wasn't rushing to spend it. She wasn't rushing at all. The card looked heavy in her hand, not like a gift, but like a burden. She slipped it back into the envelope and tucked it into her planner, almost too gently. Ethan returned to his office, heart thudding. 3 envelopes had been delivered. 3 women carried pieces of his test into the world. The clock had started. That evening, as snow whispered against the ranch windows, the first transaction pings began. His phone buzzed with alerts, each one a thread unraveling. 2 were loud, bold, immediate. 1 was almost shy, like a footstep barely pressing into fresh snow. Some people spend to be seen, some spend to be worshipped. Ethan was about to watch worship devour a person he thought he loved. The first pings came less than an hour after Madison had left the ranch. His phone lit with alerts that stacked one on another, like a drumbeat in a crowded room. A charter service to Las Vegas. A suite at a desert resort that boasted infinity pools and fire dancers. He imagined her slipping into that world as if it had been waiting for her. Neon light catching the shimmer of her dress. Her laughter louder than the bass line pulsing across the sand. By morning, receipts painted a trail of spectacle. Limited edition handbags from boutiques with velvet ropes at the entrance. A pop-up festival on the edge of the desert. Built less for music than for phone cameras. Madison moved through it all like royalty, her arm raised high to capture herself in a golden hour glow. She bought IV wellness treatments not just for herself, but for the friends who followed her like satellites. A nurse threaded clear tubes into their arms, while Madison narrated to her followers about self-care and gratitude. Ethan sat in his study, the glow of his laptop cold against his face, and scrolled through her world. She was radiant, yes, but the radiance was for strangers. Her voice grew sweeter when a camera was near, sharper when it turned away. One clip struck him hardest. Madison at a food pantry in Las Vegas, dressed in white linen, handing out grocery bags. She looked into the camera, eyes wide with compassion, and spoke about giving back. But when the camera lowered, she whispered to a friend about the smell of the place, how she couldn't wait to shower after. The footage wasn't meant for him. It was caught in the edges of another phone, but it reached him just the same. Later that day, another alert, a valet tipped with 5 crisp hundreds. The video posted within minutes, captioned with hashtags about generosity. Yet Ethan saw a private feed where she rolled her eyes, calling him cute for a peasant. He felt no anger, only an older ache. The ache of being mined for a lifestyle caption, of watching intimacy translated into content. Online murmurs followed her quickly, comments asking why she filmed every act of giving, voices questioning if the money was hers. Madison pivoted with ease. She began to use his name more often, attaching Ethan Whitaker to captions about strength, abundance, vision. She posted a photo in front of the rented suite's glass wall with the words, "Grateful for a man who believes in me." The likes poured in. The spectacle was safe again, tucked behind his shadow. By the second night, her feed turned into a personal brand launch. She ordered graphic designers to mock up a logo, booked a photographer for a desert sunrise shoot, and paid a marketing team to draft sponsorship pitches. Every swipe of the card carved his generosity into her storyline. She was no longer just Madison Hale. She was Madison, powered by Whitaker. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He did not rage. Rage would have been easier. Instead, he felt hollow, as though his life had been siphoned into someone else's commercial. He thought of Ruth, rocking on that porch swing, whispering that walls should keep people in. Madison was building walls too, but they were mirrors, angled to reflect herself over and over until nothing else remained. Snow pressed against the ranch windows. The study was silent except for the soft hum of his computer. He closed the tab, unable to watch more, yet the ache stayed. He had loved her once, or perhaps he had only loved the way she fit into the version of him that others wanted to see. His phone buzzed again. Another alert. He braced himself for more handbags, more stage mercy. But this time, the numbers were different, smaller, precise. A hotel suite in Denver, not Vegas. A wine tasting. A retainer paid to a communications firm. The trail belonged to Victoria now, and it looked quieter, sharper, calculated. Ethan drew in a breath, the ache shifting into something colder. The spectacle had been loud. What waited next was strategy. The most dangerous spending doesn't sparkle. It signs contracts in quiet rooms and smiles like it's doing you a favor. Ethan saw it unfold almost as soon as Victoria's card touched her hand. The first charge was discreet, a retainer wired to a crisis communications firm. Not for his company, not for him, but for her. Insurance tucked away. A cushion that would catch her if the ground beneath his empire shook. From there, the pattern spread like frost. A private salon dinner at a Denver townhouse. The kind where art lined the walls and glasses chimed over small plates. Donors with restless money. A rival CEO whose name still made Ethan's jaw tighten. And Victoria seated among them like she belonged more to their circle than to his. He imagined her leaning forward, her expression calm, her voice weaving stories about resilience and reputation. She had always been fluent in Polish. Now she was polishing her own future. Another ping payment for a thought leadership feature in a glossy magazine. She had secured space not to highlight his company, but to feature herself, Victoria Lang, strategist of the modern age. Ethan could almost hear the sentences, heavy with buzzwords, light on truth. The transactions grew colder. A Shell LLC registered under her middle name. A recruiter engaged to quietly map his senior team, their strengths, their weaknesses, their price tags. Even a gossip site received a quiet infusion, enough to ensure that when whispers rose, her name would glow instead of bruise. Ethan stared at the list and recognized the shape of the ladder. She was climbing, each purchase a rung, each smile a step higher, and he, for all his power, was simply the scaffolding she leaned on. When the structure was tall enough, she would leave him behind like yesterday's blueprints. He felt no anger rising, no hot rush of betrayal. What came instead was cool, surgical disappointment, a clarity he had avoided for years. He had known, somewhere in the marrow of his days, that ambition burned hotter in her veins than loyalty ever did. Still, seeing it itemized stripped away the last illusion. Oddly, there was relief in it, to finally name what she was after, to stop wondering if her sharp eyes ever softened for him alone. Now he knew they hadn't. They never would. The reports from his security chief included photos, silent but damning. Victoria seated at the head of a polished oak table, wine glass raised, her lips forming words he didn't need to hear. He could read them in the curve of her smile. Indispensable. She was calling herself indispensable, and she was doing it in rooms where people planned for his replacement. He shut the file and let the screen go dark. The study grew quiet, except for the low tick of the clock on the wall. He pressed his palms together and rested his forehead against them. He was tired of climbing ladders only to find himself alone at the top. The phone buzzed again. Another ping. He almost ignored it, bracing for more consultants, more dinners. But the numbers were different, smaller, specific. A grocery store receipt, a charge at a repair shop, a payment to a hospice supplier. Ethan sat up straighter, his eyes narrowed, leaning closer to the glow of the screen. The third card's trail looked modest, almost shy, and for the first time that night, his heart stirred with something other than weariness. Some receipts don't buy things. They buy time, breath, and a place to lay your head without shame. The reports of Claire's spending came without fanfare. No glittering suite, no salon dinner, no desert stage lit for 1,000 cameras. Just lines of numbers that looked almost embarrassed to take up space on his screen. Ethan leaned closer. The first entry surprised him. A wheelchair-accessible used van. Not new, not flashy. The kind of vehicle that had already carried its share of miles. But she had paid for repairs, insurance, and a fuel card. The title was transferred directly to Cottonwood Care Home, the small facility on the edge of town. He pictured the residents there, men and women who hadn't been outside in weeks because transport was limited. This van would not carry them to cathedrals or monuments. It would carry them to doctors' visits, to see grandchildren, to feel sunlight again. That small freedom, purchased on his card, stirred something deep. The next charges came in clusters. Bulk groceries, diapers stacked by the case, utility bills paid for a handful of families living in a trailer park scarred by wildfire. He knew the place ash still clung to the soil, and children played near fences blackened by smoke. Her receipts showed propane tanks refilled, overdue power bills cleared. A family would wake tomorrow with heat humming through their vents because she had chosen to swipe a card. Then came Ohio. His phone buzzed with a string of transactions that reached across states, all to the school district he had once trudged through in secondhand boots. Lunch debt erased in a single afternoon. Dozens of children would line up for trays without the shame of a notice stamped on their account. The envelope sent home carried no name, just a simple line. From someone who remembers being hungry. Ethan pressed his hand against his chest as he read it, the words stinging like winter air. Another receipt, almost hidden between utilities and groceries, a commission to a carpenter in his hometown. The note specified cedar wood, slat smooth by hand, hardware to withstand Ohio winters. A porch swing, not for her home, not for his ranch, but for the small park that sat 2 blocks from where Ruth once worked nights. He closed his eyes and saw it the echo of his mother's words rocking again, carved now into fresh timber. Build more than walls. The thought buckled him, quiet as prayer. And then the hospice purchases, a recliner built for end-of-life care, its padding designed to ease the pressure of fragile bones. 2 oxygen concentrators, reliable and sturdy, delivered to Cottonwood's end-of-life room. The receipt carried only one extra note, handwritten in the supplier's margin dignity. That single word landed like a hand on his shoulder from a woman who had been gone for years. Ruth was not here, yet her presence filled the study, woven through the silence. Ethan sat a long time with the file open, staring at the line item, the word repeating itself in his chest until it felt carved into him. Dignity. There were no photos, no hashtags, no performance, only invoices, cupboards a little fuller, lives a little lighter. She had moved quietly, as she always did, and somehow her silence thundered louder than Madison's parties and Victoria's dinners combined. The house seemed to breathe with him as he closed the file. For the first time in days, the ache inside him softened. But before peace could take root, another current broke in. A rumor sprouted online. A blog post whispering that a billionaire had handed out 3 no-limit cards as some kind of twisted experiment. The calls would come, reporters would dig, the board would panic, the hourglass still ran, its sand falling fast. Ethan rubbed his eyes and leaned back, torn between dread and a fragile hope he dared not name. When rumor meets money, truth gets bruised. Ethan knew at the moment the first article went live. A business blog, small but vicious, ran a piece hinting that a billionaire in Colorado had handed out 3 limitless credit cards. An experiment in loyalty. The headline teased, no names, no photos, but enough breadcrumbs to stir the markets. Within hours, the story was reposted, reframed, reshaped into speculation. Reporters circled, each version sharpening like a knife. The board called an emergency session. On his screen, their faces formed a mosaic of polished panic. Words like optics, liability, and damage control filled the air. Some demanded a press release. Others urged him to deny everything, to bury it under unrelated news. A few hinted that he should consider stepping back for a time, let a proxy shield him. Workers whispered too. Emails slipped into his inbox, unsigned. Some accused him of playing games with people's dignity. Others simply asked if it was true. He imagined warehouse break rooms where voices rose and trust bent under weight. He had built his fortune on their backs, and now even their laughter carried suspicion. He listened to it all, then closed the laptop without answering. He would not hide behind handlers. He would not weaponize PR against the truth. The experiment had never been meant for spectacle, and he would not allow it to become a circus. Instead, he opened the files again. Claire's receipts waited in quiet rows. He scrolled past groceries, past propane tanks, past diapers stacked into carts. Again, his eyes circled back to the hospice chair and the porch swing commission. One bought comfort in the last hours of life. The other gave children a place to rest in the first years of it. Between them lay the whole span of human need, and she had answered it without fanfare. He pressed his palms flat against the desk. Madison had turned the card into confetti. Victoria had converted it into leverage. Claire had turned it into mercy. Which one reflected the kind of world he wanted to build? Which one reflected the man he wanted to be? The question burned until he stood, restless. He walked the length of the ranch house, the timber beams creaking like old bones in the cold. He touched the wool sleeve of his sweater, grounding himself in its rough weave. He paused at the window, watching snow deepen along the drive, road salt already scattered by his groundskeeper. Each small detail of the evening sharpened his resolve. He would not let others spin the story. He would face it, not with lawyers drafting statements, not with cameras catching angles. He would bring the truth into a room and sit with it. 3 women, 1 table, no speeches, no handlers. The barn would serve. He had converted it years ago, laying long planks of oak across sawhorses to make a table big enough for gatherings he never held. The walls smelled of hay and varnish. Lantern hooks still lined the beams. He fetched a box of oil lamps from storage, trimmed their wicks, and lit them one by one. Flames rose, soft and golden, pushing shadows into corners. Courage, he realized, was not fireworks. It was not shouting from podiums or standing before cameras. Courage was a man opening a barn in winter, lighting lanterns with his own hands, and deciding to tell the truth even when it cut. By the time the last lamp glowed, snow had thickened outside. The path from the ranch to the barn lay blanketed, unbroken, waiting for footsteps. He stood in the doorway, the lanterns casting halos against the timber walls, and breathed deep. The air tasted of cedar and cold. Tomorrow, the women would arrive. Tomorrow, masks would fall. For tonight, only the lanterns bore witness. Boardrooms polish truth. Old wood asks it to sit down and tell the whole story. The barn glowed with lantern light. Their flames wavered in the draft that seeped through the timbers, each halo catching on the reclaimed oak table he had dragged to the center. Stoneware mugs waited, filled with coffee that steamed against the cold. Snow pressed heavy against the roof. A hush so deep it felt as though the mountain itself was listening. Ethan sat at the head, the grain of the table rough under his hands. He had chosen this setting on purpose. No leather chairs, no polished glass, no board members to smooth the edges. Only wood that remembered storms and a man tired of pretending. When the 3 women entered, the lanterns caught their faces differently. Madison shimmered in perfume and phone light, her coat a slash of white against the dark beams. Victoria moved with calm control, black wool framing her sharpness, every gesture measured. Claire hesitated at the threshold, her breath visible in the cold, her sweater plain and warm. They sat, the mugs untouched. For a moment, silence swelled until Ethan spoke. His voice carried the weight of stone. He told them the truth. The envelopes had been a test. No rules, no limits. 72 hours. He confessed the harm that watching had stripped them of privacy, that his hunger for honesty might have crossed lines. He owned it, plain and unvarnished. Then he named the choices. Madison first. her days of spectacle, the parties, the staged mercy. He spoke of the valet, the food pantry clip, the laughter that mocked when the camera turned away. Madison's face hardened, her eyes flashing. She rose, perfume trailing sharp as she snatched her phone from the table. The lantern light caught the gleam of her earrings as she stormed out, heels striking the floor like gunfire. Snow swallowed her figure before the barn door closed. Victoria next. He laid her ladder bare, the retainer padding her future, the dinners where his name became currency, the magazine spreads prepaid. He spoke of the shell company, the recruiter charting his team. Victoria did not flinch. She only straightened, her expression carved from frost. She did not argue. She only said, in a voice steady as winter, "That ambition is never a crime." Then she rose, leaving behind the chill of separation. The lantern seemed to flicker as the door closed on her shadow. Only Claire remained. Ethan turned to her slowly, his chest tight. He spoke not with accusation, but with awe. Her receipts had read like a diary of mercy, a van for Cottonwood. Groceries and heat for families marked by fire, lunch debt erased in Ohio, signed by someone who remembered hunger, a porch swing in cedar, echoing Ruth's words, a hospice chair, a note that carried only dignity. He did not embellish, he only spoke what was true. And when he finished, the barn filled with silence again. Not silence as judgment, but silence that felt like prayer. The lanterns hummed, the mug steamed and cooled, snow tapped against the walls. Claire lowered her gaze, her hands folded in her lap. Gratitude moved in the room without needing to be spoken. For a long time, none of them moved. The quiet itself bore witness. Then Ethan's phone vibrated against the table, the sound startling in the hush. A text from Cottonwood Care Home. The hospice chair had been delivered. A family was using it tonight. The words lit the screen softly, but in Ethan's chest they rang louder than Madison's parties or Victoria's salons. Real lives, real comfort, resting in something his mother would have called good. The lanterns glowed on, steady and unshaken. As snow deepened outside, he thought heartbreak was a crack. Tonight, it was a door. The first update reached him before dawn. Cottonwood's hospice wing. A nurse had written, plain and without flourish, that the new recliner eased the back of a woman who had been sleeping upright for days, waiting beside her father. That night, she held his hand through the hours without pain numbing her shoulders. When his breath finally slowed, she was still there, seated in comfort, dignity preserved. Ethan read the note twice, the words blurring as if the screen itself breathed. Later came a message from the van driver. Residents had climbed in slowly, tentative at first, as though the wheels might betray them. But once moving, the air inside shifted. They laughed. They told stories about farms, about dances in barns, about wars survived. The driver described the ride as noisy in the best way, voices tumbling over one another after weeks of quiet isolation. A small van had carried them to appointments. Yes, but it had also carried them back into life. Another ping from Ohio. A school clerk's handwriting scanned into the report. One word repeated down the page, cleared. Each lunch debt erased with a careful pen stroke. Behind the clerical neatness, Ethan imagined faces. A boy stepping into line without fear of being told to move aside. A girl eating hot lunch without her cheeks burning with shame. The act was small on paper, but in lives still forming, it was a weight lifted. By afternoon, an image of the park arrived. The swing had been hung, cedar shining fresh against winter gray. Children lined up at dusk, coats zipped to their chins, their boots dragging furrows in the dirt as they pushed. A couple, gray-haired and slow, rested grocery bags at their feet and sat together, breathing while the swing creaked beside them. Ethan felt the scene in his chest, the rhythm of chains echoing his mother's voice. Build more than walls. The receipts were never about objects. Claire had not bought things. She had bought hours of dignity, hours where a daughter could grieve without numbness, where elders could laugh on the road, where children could eat in peace, where weary hands could rest on a bench beneath a sky that once belonged to his mother. He closed the files, but the images remained. Ruth's sentence, long buried under contracts and balance sheets, returned to the world in acts so humble he might have missed them if he had not looked close. And now it pressed against his ribs until his chest hurt, in the way grief and gratitude sometimes share the ache that says something lost has been found again, though never in the same form. He sat at the oak table, lanterns burning low, and let the silence wash over him. This was not heartbreak in the old sense. It was not the shattering of trust or the loss of love. It was the breaking open of something walled too long, the reminder that wealth could polish, but mercy could rebuild. Outside, dawn edged the ridge, light spilled across the snow, pale and insistent. Ethan knew the night had carried more than revelations. It carried responsibility. If his company did not match mercy with policy, if the dignity Claire purchased did not ripple outward, then all of it would collapse into performance. He rose, bones stiff from sitting, and stepped to the barn door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and honest. The world waited. The test had shown him truth. Now the harder work began choosing to live by it. If a card could reveal a heart, a policy could protect one. Ethan carried that truth like a stone in his pocket, heavy but grounding. The first changes were simple. A wellness fund was created, seated quietly and administered without red tape. Workers who faced sudden medical bills or housing emergencies could apply without fear of exposure. No press release announced it. Only a quiet memo, circulated with the heading, "For when life turns fast." Next came family leave pilots, paid time not just for birth or loss, but for moments in between, caring for an aging parent, walking with a child through surgery, sitting by a spouse in recovery. He pushed it through even when the board grimaced at costs. The expense would be real, yes, but so would the loyalty it cultivated. Executive bonuses shifted too, no longer tied only to growth metrics and investor applause, but to safety records and employee satisfaction. A clean year without accidents meant more than another percentage point in quarterly return. For the first time, bonuses bent toward the warehouse floor, not just the corner office. And then came the hardship channel. Anonymous, encrypted, open to any employee with a burden too heavy to carry alone. A family facing eviction, a worker choosing between medication and rent. Each message landed on Ethan's desk with no names, only stories. He read them late into the night, a thermos of black coffee at his side. He could not fix everything, but he could make sure no voice was ignored. His own habits bent with the change. He shed handlers where he could, stripping away layers that kept him insulated. Some mornings, he drove to the warehouses unannounced, stepping into the chill of loading bays with a thermos in hand. He listened more than he spoke. He asked about injuries, about families, about what had been overlooked. He stood among pallets and forklifts, feeling the grit under his boots, remembering where he had come from. The largest step was naming the initiative. He called it Ruth and Claire. Ruth, the mother who had taught him that walls mattered less than the lives inside them. Claire, the woman who had proven mercy could be purchased with precision. Claire resisted at first. She wanted no spotlight, no press conference, no ceremonial title. He promised her anonymity, promised results would matter more than headlines. Only then did she agree to steward operations tracking the funds, verifying outcomes, making sure the changes held to their intent. It was not a promotion story. It was a purpose story. Together they sat in his study, papers spread, mugs cooling. The work was unglamorous policies drafted, audits scheduled, partners vetted. But under the hum of fluorescent lamps, something sacred stirred. These reforms were love made public, not the sentimental kind, but the kind that showed up in pay stubs and sick leave and chairs built to ease a last breath. Weeks turned, snow melted into sleet, sleet into rain. One evening, after a day of meetings that left him raw, Ethan drove Claire home. The wipers beat steady against the windshield. They passed the park. The swing stood there in the wet, cedar darkened but steady, waiting. Children would return when skies cleared. For now, it endured, patient as hope. Ethan slowed the car. Claire glanced at the swing, then at him. Neither spoke. Some truths didn't need words. Scandal is loud. Keeping promises is quiet and harder. Months had passed since the winter night in the barn. Headlines had dulled, investors had adjusted, and whispers had faded into background noise. What remained was harder to measure, safer shifts, fewer injuries logged, managers trained to notice the droop in shoulders or the hollow in a voice before exhaustion broke someone down. Change didn't look like fireworks. It looked like workers walking through their front doors with enough strength left to hug their children. Ethan carried those quiet victories like stones in his coat pocket. Heavy, grounding, reminders. He no longer needed cameras or speeches. His measure was found in hands that shook less, in accidents that no longer filled the weekly reports, in overtime hours that shrank instead of swelled. Each week he returned to Cottonwood. No entourage, no formalities. He carried grocery bags through the door, listening to the squeak of his boots on the linoleum. Sometimes he sat with a resident who loved old country music, letting the twang of fiddles and steel guitars fill the room. He didn't bring answers. He didn't bring promises. He brought time. Time, he realized, was the rarest currency he could give. The swing became another ritual. He stopped there often, a hot cup warming his hands, his coat zipped against sleet. At 30, he had never paused long enough to hear the creak of chains in the cold. Now he stood quietly, watching breath leave him in clouds. Children's laughter filled the air in memory, even when the playground was empty. The swing measured him not by wealth, but by patience he had learned too late and was grateful to hold now. For those who asked what the test had taught, his answer was steady. The worth of a life is counted in hours returned to other people. Dignity given back, breath made easier, meals eaten without shame. Those hours were what mattered, and he wanted to spend the rest of his own returning as many as he could. One evening, sitting with Claire by the kitchen fire, the realization came clear. He no longer needed experiments. He no longer needed envelopes or surveillance. Trust wasn't something you tested. It was something you practiced. And in the warmth of that fire, he felt a peace deeper than any applause had ever given. Yet one thing lingered. He had not yet visited the school office in Ohio. He had not yet thanked the clerk whose careful pen strokes had written, "Cleared across the lunch debts." That trip waited, tugging at him like a loose thread. He knew he would go. Some gratitude needed to be spoken face to face. The fire popped, throwing sparks. Outside, snow had melted into mud and mud into grass. Seasons had turned, storms had passed, and Ethan sat steady, no longer waiting for proof of love, but giving it. He once kept a box to protect himself. Now he keeps a bench for strangers. The trip to Ohio came in early spring. The air smelled faintly of thawed earth and new rain. Ethan drove alone, no driver, no staff, only a thermos and a coat folded on the seat beside him. Hours stretched across the highway, familiar landscapes sliding past, fields half brown, half green, barns leaning against sky. He was 45, returning not for business, but for something quieter, something overdue. The park looked smaller than he remembered. The swing stood near the edge, cedar pale against the grass. Its chains clinked in the wind, steady and patient. Children's voices carried faintly from another corner of the park, but here, the bench waited. He sat. The wood was cool under his palms, the slats giving a little as if welcoming him back. He carried a small box, one he had kept shut for decades. Inside were the scraps of a life ticket stubs from county fairs, a grocery receipt from the winter Ruth had skipped her own meal to feed him, a corner of a faded photograph with her smile caught in half shadow. He had guarded it as proof of something he feared losing. Now he opened it under open sky, the swing rocking gently as if to hold him steady. For a long time, he simply sat, letting memory breathe in the space between him and the wood. Ruth's voice came again. Build more than walls. He traced the letters on the receipt, the ink nearly gone, and felt the weight of all the hours Claire's choices had given back to strangers. Time, breath, dignity. From his coat pocket he drew a folded note. On it, in his own hand, were 7 words for the days that feel too heavy. He tucked it under the armrest, a message left not for one person, but for anyone who might need it. A small mercy, waiting in cedar and ink. He leaned back, watching the branches sway overhead. The world had not grown simpler. Policies still required teeth. Markets still demanded numbers. But mercy had found its place in his ledger now, steady as the swing beneath him. The initiative went on without fanfare. More hospice chairs delivered, more vans insured, more envelopes marked cleared in the careful hands of clerks. No cameras, no speeches, just lives breathing easier in rooms that might otherwise have been suffocating. He did not need a twist to end the story. The lasting image was enough. A man on a swing, a box open at last. Scraps of memory turned to seed for mercy. For those listening, he offered a gentle invitation. Remember a small kindness that changed your life. Hold it close. Let it guide your next one. The world shifts not by spectacle, but by such seeds carried forward. As dusk deepened, Ethan rose, leaving the swing to the wind. Behind him, the note waited. Ahead of him, more stories of ordinary mercy would come. That was the promise. Soft, steady, enduring. We live in a world that often measures worth in numbers, salaries, houses, titles, likes on a screen. But Ethan's story reminds us of a truth that does not fade with age. The real measure of a life is not what we keep, but what we give back. A credit card can buy handbags, parties, or influence, but in Claire's hands. It bought hours of rest for the weary, meals for the hungry, and dignity for those at the edge of life. For those of us who have seen decades come and go, the lesson is simple yet profound. We may not have billions to give, but every kindness, every meal shared, every listening ear, every porch swing offered creates ripples that outlast us. Security is not found in wealth alone. It is found in trust, in compassion, in building spaces where others can breathe easier. So, perhaps the question we each must ask is this: when the hours of our life are counted, how many will belong to others? And in that answer, we may discover not just what we lived for, but what we truly kept. Thank you, dear friends, for spending this time with us and for opening your hearts to this story. If it touched you, even in a small way, please give it a like, share it with someone you care about, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of kindness, hope, and second chances to life. Until next time, may your days be filled with compassion and peace.